Fears of a nuclear apocalypse led governments towards some weird and morally suspect ideas during the Cold War. They ran the gamut of things most people associate with the era, like radiation, espionage, and strange experiments. Keep watching for some truly messed up things that happened during the Cold War. You probably know about the nuclear bombs that hit Japan at the end of World War II, but there's more to this story. In addition to the 2 nuclear cores and the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a 3rd core was also prepared, but Japan surrendered before it could be used. So instead, it was turned into a tool for Manhattan Project researchers interested in high-risk radiation experiments. In August 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian went into the lab alone and surrounded the core with tungsten carbide bricks, meant to reflect neutrons back to the core, pushing it closer to criticality. He accidentally dropped one of the bricks onto the core, which went critical, bathing him in the blue light of a deadly reaction. And this wasn't an isolated incident. In May 1946, Canadian physicist Louis Slotin was running a similar test, almost completely shielding the core with a pair of beryllium half-spheres, which he kept apart with just a screwdriver. The screwdriver slipped and the core went critical. Both Daghlian and Slotin died of radiation poisoning. The core was dubbed the Demon Core, and criticality experiments were no longer conducted hands-on at Los Alamos National Laboratory. As reported by The New Yorker, in the 50s and 60s, American military Dr. Jim Ketchum believed that chemicals like LSD and BZ were a humane alternative to guns and bullets. But the military couldn't just start using these weapons. They had to test them out first, and their methods played fast and loose with morality. Army personnel would consent to taking part in these experiments, but they were never told that they involved drugs. They might get sprayed in the face with a liquid that they thought was water but was actually LSD, or they might get stuck in an experiment called the Longest Weekend, a 3-day test in which 4 volunteers were dosed with varying levels of BZ and locked inside a room, where they had to complete so-called missions. 1 soldier was given a placebo, 2 were given a more moderate dose, and the 4th was high to the point of incapacitation. The reason for the secrecy was that the researchers didn't want the volunteers' knowledge of being high to affect how they would act while drugged, which doesn't exactly do much to assuage concerns about morality. In the wake of World War II, radiation was a major concern. Understanding the long-term effects of radiation exposure was understandably important, but that importance hardly justifies some of the things that researchers did, in particular testing the effects of radiation on unwitting subjects with injections of radioactive elements. Researchers would find hospital patients with bleak diagnoses and inject them with highly dangerous amounts of plutonium. These injections were kept completely separate from medical records and done without the patients knowing what the injections really were. The point of the research was to see how the body would hold on to or secrete the radioactive element. And it doesn't end there. The doses given to these patients were sometimes 5 times the maximum limit that the body might be able to handle, and were given while knowing that plutonium would be absorbed by bones and kept there for years. So not only did researchers know that these injections wouldn't be helpful, they also had a pretty good idea just how harmful they would be.
Wait a minute, are you telling me that this sucker is nuclear?
A number of different studies involving radiation were carried out during the Cold War, and ethics were unfortunately often a secondary concern. For example, as reported by the Associated Press, researchers in the 1940s at a free clinic at Vanderbilt University gave iron pills to over 750 pregnant women to study how their bodies absorb the iron. The Alliance for Human Research Protection has similar information, stating that 820 pregnant women were given iron as part of a cocktail drink. The problem was that these pills contained radioactive iron, which was reportedly intended as a tracer for absorption mechanisms. It's also likely that none of these women actually knew what was in these pills or that they were part of an experiment. Furthermore, the records were destroyed in the 1970s, which would naturally arouse suspicion. Studies in the 60s indicate that a handful of these women's babies died young as a result of various cancers. Initially, these results were written off as insignificant, but later investigations concluded that it was probably because of exposure to radiation. After all, when compared to a group of unexposed women, there weren't any similar cases. In the 50s and 60s, the CIA was legitimately concerned about mind control and decided to become masters of it themselves. The point of this operation, known as MK-Ultra, was to find a way to essentially break the human psyche and then replace a person's consciousness with whatever the CIA wanted. MK-Ultra's experimental techniques included the likes of electroshock treatments, extreme temperatures, isolation, general psychological torture, and plenty of drugs. Some people volunteered to be a part of the research, but not everyone, like prisoners whom the researchers figured were expendable. In general, most people didn't really know what they were signing up for. Mob boss Whitey Bulger, who was incarcerated at the time, thought he was part of a study to cure schizophrenia. But what really happened was that he was dosed with LSD every day for more than a year. He wrote about his experiences as he described hallucinations like people turning into skeletons and blood dripping from the walls. To top it all off, the project even hired Nazi doctors for their expertise, and then most of the records were destroyed. In 1955 in San Francisco, there was a nice, unassuming house furnished with a French theme, but it was actually a CIA safe house. 225 Chestnut Street was the main location for Operation Midnight Climax, one of the most bizarre experiments of Project MK Ultra. The CIA had hoped to use LSD as a truth serum, while combining that with their findings that subjects were more likely to give up secrets shortly after physical intimacy. CIA agents paid female sex workers to lure unwitting subjects back to the safe house where they would be dosed with LSD. From behind a two-way mirror, the agents could watch what happened next. A second safe house was set up in Marin County, and it became the CIA's playground for all sorts of different substances and delivery methods. George White, the head of the operation, loved the voyeuristic aspect of it all, as he reportedly later asked, where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? During the Cold War, the Soviets got really creative with poison. Back in 1921, they created an entire facility dedicated to perfecting poisons. Called variously the Special Room, Laboratory No. 1, Lab X, Laboratory No. 12, and the Chimera, it had a particular goal in mind, discovering poisons that were odorless, tasteless, and invisible to autopsies. In chasing that goal, the lab came up with some pretty scary stuff, like a gaseous form of cyanide, as well as poisons that made the cause of death appear to be a heart attack. A bunch of people fell prey to these poisons, including potential spies, dissidents, and political enemies, and that's not even counting the unfortunate test subjects, who were typically political prisoners. Unsurprisingly, everything was covered up and kept secret. It was so secretive that even Mikhail Gorbachev was denied a briefing in 1988. And as The Guardian reported in 2018, there was even speculation that the program was still going, functioning the same way it did decades ago. There was a time when the United States wanted to nuke the moon. That might sound like the plot of a bad sci-fi movie, but sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Sputnik was the immediate cause behind this absolutely ridiculous-sounding plan. When the satellite was successfully launched in 1957, it appeared for all intents and purposes that the Soviets had taken the lead in the space race.
In comparison, the United States was feared to be looking puny.
For American officials, that was disastrous. They needed something big and flashy, something utterly ridiculous, just to prove to the rest of the world that the United States was still the mightier superpower. And that led to the question, is it possible to launch a hydrogen bomb at the moon? And would it create a mushroom cloud visible to everyone on Earth? Research into this idea really was conducted, leading to the answer that it was entirely possible to hit the moon with a hydrogen bomb. Obviously, though the American government didn't go through with it. It was determined that because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere like Earth's, there wouldn't really be a big mushroom cloud. Instead, debris would fly up but not back down, thus no distinct mushroom shape. Furthermore, people on Earth would probably just see the flash of an explosion, which would have been way less exciting than intended. Also, for publicity stunt prospects aside, people weren't exactly on board with bombing a place that humans might want to, and eventually would, visit in the not-too-distant future. Considering the paranoia and constant fear over nuclear warfare during the Cold War, it really shouldn't be surprising that this era saw the development of some absolutely insane weapon ideas. Project Pluto was one of those ideas. The plans detail a new kind of nuclear missile that would have been powered by a nuclear reactor. It would take in the air, heat it up, and use that expanded air to propel itself. The so-called SLAM missile could fly for long stretches of time, all while being easily maneuverable before reaching its target and detonating the warhead that it carried. The cruise missile was also uniquely devastating. The nuclear reactor that it used to propel itself wasn't actually shielded by anything, as concrete would have made it too heavy to fly. Thus, all the radiation the reactor created would just be released into the air, raining down on whatever the missile flew over. And that wasn't all. The supersonic missile was so loud that designers thought that anyone it passed over would be killed by the shockwave alone. Basically, the Project Pluto missile would have been a flying death machine, spewing radiation and shattering windows everywhere it passed. Aside from the horrifying image the missile presented, it was impossible to test, as it couldn't be flown over friendly territory at all. Ultimately, it was abandoned in 1964. If you've ever heard of the Geneva Conventions, perhaps you've also heard of biological warfare being outlawed in the 1920s. But that didn't end research into it. Anthrax, cholera, and botulinum toxin could easily be devastating, so during World War II, the United States sponsored research into these weapons. Post-war, there were tests on civilian populations during the 50s and 60s. Agents would carry briefcases or light bulbs into airports or subways, releasing bacterial agents into the air to track how bacteria might travel through a population. The Pentagon itself was even a test location. One notable test was carried out in San Francisco in 1950. 2 types of bacteria were sprayed into the air of San Francisco Bay over the course of about a week. The city's inhabitants were breathing in millions of these bacteria every day, and at least 1 person died, potentially from the tests. The researchers believed that the bacteria they used was harmless, although later reports unsurprisingly disputed this. More than 200 of these tests were conducted, and the affected civilian populations had no say in what was happening, nor any idea that they were being used as guinea pigs. And even when the government was confronted with the San Francisco experiment, they managed to shirk responsibility for any damage, as they claimed they didn't need the public's permission to carry out these tests. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about world history are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.